Now that we understand how dependency injection works in JavaScript, and in particular how it works in AngularJS, we need to talk about protecting our dependency injection from minification. You'll see why that's necessary in just a minute. First of all, what is minification? Well, minification is the process of removing all unnecessary characters from source code, and what's here, I italicize here, is without changing the functionality of the source code. So it should be clear that minification is going to be the process that's going to make our code completely unreadable, yet at the same time 100% functional as before. In fact, many minification programs actually call themselves uglify, so they uglify the code. So the minification process takes out a whole bunch of things. It takes out white space characters, new line characters, comments. It even removes some curly braces that we use for code readability. So what's the purpose of all that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It reduces the amount of data transferred from the server. Once all these characters are removed from the JavaScript file, the file itself becomes much, much smaller. By the way, if you want a fun read, if you go to my LinkedIn page, which is linkedin.com/n/Yakov Chaikin, and I will give you a link to that as well, you're more than welcome, first of all, to connect with me. I accept pretty much all the invitations from any of the students. But you can also look in my published by me articles, and one of them, if you want to have a fun read, is called Why is jQuery Min Code Such a Mess? Now notice that I did write this on April 1st, 2016. You can also read a little bit about me and what I do, as well as my boasting that the first course, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for web developers, became #1 top-rated course on Coursera, and it stayed actually there for 3 weeks. And hopefully at the time you're watching it, it still remains a top-rated course. For now, however, let's go ahead and jump into our editor and see how minification can actually ruin our dependency injection and break our application, and what to do about it. Okay, I'm back in my editor, and I'm located in the Lecture 10 folder, which is located in the fullstack-course 5/examples folder. And this is the same application we've seen before, which basically just uppercases the contents of a text box once it loses focus. So if we click on it and click out of it again, you could see that it uppercased everything inside the text box. Let's go back to our code and actually select the whole thing. We'll copy it, and we'll go to a website called JavaScript Minifier. And you could Google for different minifiers out there, but I chose this one. It's javascript-minifier.com. And what you could do is you could paste your JavaScript code here and click Minify. And this is the Minify JavaScript. And you go ahead and copy that. If we go back to our code editor, we could comment out everything that we have there and just literally just substitute it with this new minified version and save that. And since browser sync is running already, we should be able to go back to our page. Oh, look at that. It's not working. Why isn't it working? If we click on this link right here, it's showing us an error. It will give us what the error message is, and it's error something to do with the injector. The injector in the DI controller is not working. Well, the reason it's not working is actually pretty simple. And that's because that $scope and $filter really disappeared. You can't see it anywhere here. And those are the names that Angular was looking for in order to know what to inject into this DI controller that is no longer called DI controller, but if you look closely here, it's now called N. It's the N function. So it just basically minified the entire name DI controller into N. So how do we solve this? Well, let's go ahead and erase this code again, and we'll select all of this code and uncomment it. And to solve the problem, we have a couple of approaches. Number one is, in the controller function itself, the second argument right now is a function value. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be. It can be an array, and it's an array of strings with the last element in the array being the function that is responsible to be the controller function. And in this case, we can actually specify what this controller function is supposed to expect. So if we say scope, and we also say $filter, what we've told Angular is that scope and filter in this order is going to be appearing as the arguments into this DI controller function, which is right here. The first one is scope, and the second one is filter. And the reason we can even have an array like that, which is a string and another string and a function value, is because arrays in JavaScript allow different types to be items in that array. Now, these strings are protected from minification because these are string literals. Similarly, this name Yakov right here is a string literal, and it will never get minified because it's real data. So the minifier doesn't really know that this is kind of our code data and not the real data, and therefore it will leave this alone. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's select all this, copy it. We'll go back to our minifier. We'll close this. We'll go back to our minifier. We'll select all this, paste our new code, click minify, and now we'll take this whole thing, copy it, go back to our code, comment it out, and we'll paste this new code in, and we'll hit save, and let's go back to our page and see if there's any errors. Doesn't look like it, so we'll click in here, click out, it's working 100%. So that's great, but I think we can improve it a little bit more in terms of style. Let's go ahead and erase all this, and again, we'll uncomment our code. And you should just know that when you look online, a lot of the examples online show you this technique in an even more uglier fashion. And now let me show you what I mean by that. So here I'm passing a function value, but I don't have to. I could, if I wanted to, actually create a function right here straight in line and go ahead and specify scope and then specify filter right here in line. And I could just copy the contents of my controller function right here and paste it right there. So that's the same function. In fact, if I save that right now, it should probably still work. Let's take a look. And sure enough, it works because now the code that's being executed is inside this function. So I just did this inline as opposed to taking it outside of the statement. And as you can see, it's very hard to read. First of all, we're mixing a whole bunch of things in an array, which is already hard to read. And even though that's legal JavaScript, readability really suffers here. So let's go ahead and undo all this real quick and do one better. Instead of specifying it here, we're going to leave this alone and leave it as it was before without the array construct in the controller call. What we're going to do instead is attach an extra property to the controller function value itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to say di controller dot $inject. And we're going to have that equal first scope and second filter. $filter. And if we do that, one Angular is going to look for this function, is going to also look and check to see whether or not we have a $inject property on the function that is supposed to be the controller. And if it finds it, it will use that array as guidance to see which service to inject into which argument on the controller function itself. So if we save this and go ahead and copy it, go to our minifier. Let's minify that. And we'll copy it again. Go back, select this and comment it out. And we'll paste the minified code. And when we save it, let's go back to our web page to see if this works. And as you can see, it worked. In fact, let's uncomment this again. In fact, this is really a much more elegant solution, and the readability improves tremendously. So to summarize, we spoke about minification, which is the process of reducing the size of our JavaScript. And the way minification works is it removes extra characters, which are actually very important for us when we read the code, but completely irrelevant for the JavaScript engine when it runs it. And therefore, it's advantageous to actually minify your code, especially when you go to production, because the size of the file is going to be smaller, and therefore your web page will load faster because it will download a smaller file size. So the lessons learned from that is that dependency injection in Angular needs to be minification proof. And the way to do this is a couple of methods. Number one is we can have an inline array with function as the last element in the array. That works. But a more elegant way is to attach a $inject property to the function object that is being injected into. And Angular will look for that $inject property and will use that $inject property, or I should say the value of it, which should be that same array we spoke about minus the last element as the function, just the array of the names of the arguments. It will use that as a guide to know where to inject which service.